quick note, this episode discusses incidents of child abuse. Bridey's mom lived a life of drugs, alcohol, instability, and dangerous boyfriends. And Bridey noticed.
I remember there was a time I was about 15 and a boy came over to take me to a dance and she offered him a shot of tequila. And, she made fun of me for not drinking and she said, "Oh, you're just so straight." And I said, "Well, you're so crooked."
Welcome to In This Family, presented by Nexus Family Healing. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO. To a child, everything in their family life is normal because they have nothing to compare it to. They're less likely to recognize that abuse, substance use issues, neglect, and general instability are causing damage, both in the immediate and long term. It's often only later in life when we start to piece together what really happened and what harm has been done. Bridey Thelen-Heidel is a teacher in Lake Tahoe, California. She's spent the last 25 years teaching English to middle schoolers and high schoolers, giving special attention to the kids who might be in a tough situation at home. That's because she had been in the same boat, abused and neglected by her mother, who also drank heavily and used drugs, as did the series of abusive men her mom had around. Bridey was never in a stable living situation for long and was thrust into the role of parent for her half-sister Bevins because, frankly, the job was open and someone needed to do it. I happened to pick up a copy of Bridey's memoir, Bright Eyes, and I really loved it and I couldn't put it down. Her life experiences were beyond anything a child should face. Her stories of surviving her childhood, becoming so resilient, then going on to college, facing her trauma, and finding a happy life were remarkable. So I wanted to share her story with you. As a kid, Bridey spent time in Alaska and Lake Tahoe, where she now lives with her husband of 30 years. But it's hard for Bridey to say where she's from.
Yeah, I changed schools 22 times before I graduated from high school, and that was primarily because my mom was ridiculous and dysfunctional and chasing dangerous men and addicted to them and their drugs. And so we were really running from men or running to men, running away from her bad decisions. I used to say when I was a kid and people asked why we moved so much, I just said my mom liked to move. And now I realize we were running because she had just gotten out of jail. She was avoiding bills. We couldn't pay for things. And so those were all just trauma responses.
And then just to figure out who else maybe is part of your story, talk about who your dad or dads are.
So I was raised thinking I had one dad. His name is Jim. And when I was about 6 years old, my mom told me that he wasn't my real dad. But then my biological dad's name was also Jim, so it shouldn't really matter. And I titled that chapter in the book, "He's Not a Goldfish," because, you can swap them out very easily. So I was blessed with two really wonderful dads, and they didn't know much about what was going on, and they had their own issues and families also, because my mom and dad got divorced when I was a baby. And so they weren't really there much when I was growing up, except later on when I became old enough to know that I wanted to get to know them better.
Yeah, great. Okay. And then how do you answer questions about who are all your siblings?
So in terms of siblings, so my two dads both had their own children, and I don't have any siblings with both parents. So I have 9. That's kind of how I describe it. I have 9 siblings, 3 sisters with my mom, 3 with my biological dad, and then 3 with my first dad. I guess step siblings, you could consider that. I don't really have contact with many of them, mostly just with my sister Bevins.
And we'll talk about Bevins here in a minute. So your childhood was pretty traumatic. When someone asks about your early trauma, what do you say?
So I think as an adult, I've come to learn that the trauma that I really survived and have endured and learned how to heal is really the trauma of growing up with an abusive, narcissistic, alcoholic mother. and the trauma that comes with rescuing her and putting her before me, no matter what, no matter how dangerous it was. And the trauma of kind of the gaslighting that comes with growing up in a family like that, with a mother like that. So you're really led to question every decision that you make. You're not supposed to believe reality. You're not supposed to believe your own intuition or listen to your gut instincts. You know, obviously what comes with a lot of that, with abuse and addiction and her choosing really dangerous men is there's physical abuse, there's sexual abuse, there's mental abuse. But I think the most devastating trauma that I've had to deal with is just the lack of a mother protecting me.
Do you remember the age that you were when you first started to realize something's not right here?
Oh, yeah. Middle school. And I think middle school is really, I think, such a crucial time because I'm a teacher and I taught middle school for a while. And we start to, 12 and 13-year-olds start to develop abstract thought. And you can start to, we teach personification in middle school because kids are just starting to develop that awareness. And I think by 12 years old, I was looking at my mom and I was coming home from 7th grade and realizing that her drinking was a real problem. And my friends' parents weren't napping in the afternoon and she wasn't staying at work all day long. And, you know, between watching friends' parents and TV shows, I was realizing that something was really wrong. Nancy Reagan had just come out with her Just Say No to Drugs campaign. So that was all over our middle school. And, you know, they had the posters up and I was kind of checking them off like, oh, I think that's my mom.
Yeah. Can you tell us some stories that really stand out for you that really impacted your sense of your mom just not protecting you?
Yeah, I think one of the first awarenesses, I was really young and I was like 7 years old and I had a really bad cold, like the flu, you know, the shivering kind of throwing up kind. And I just needed my mom and she chose to leave with her boyfriend and set a pitcher of lemonade next to me on the floor. She made a little bed for me and told me that she would call me in a couple hours, but I would be fine. And I remember realizing that she was choosing him. And up until that point, it had really been she and I just adored her. And I think that was the first time when I realized something was weird and she wasn't really going to be there to take care of me. She had another episode a couple years later when she broke up with that boyfriend and she was on a binge and she was out all the time and I was really left to my own. And she went to jail for 3 days. And I didn't know for what, but I later figured out it was probably a DUI because that's about the amount of time that you go to jail for a DUI. And I was left alone for 3 days and cooking for myself and cleaning and, you know, made the best of it as a kid. But I definitely, again, was realizing I was kind of on my own. And that's before my little sister was born. And so I would just have friends come over and kind of play house, you know?
Yeah, and so the adults around you did not know that you were living by yourself, taking care of yourself those 3 days?
Yeah, so because we moved so much, there wasn't really a lot of people to check on me. We had some neighbors at that particular house when I was home alone. I was 9 or 10 and I was home alone for those 3 days. And I have a feeling the neighbor came over and checked on me. But, you know, this was in the early 80s and it just wasn't the same as now. You know, I think people kept to themselves. People didn't ask questions. I certainly never had CPS coming and checking, and, you know, it must have been summertime because I wasn't going to school. And certainly by that age, I was conditioned not to tell. So my mom had 2 phrases that she taught me by that age. And she said to me very clearly when I was probably, you know, around that age, if anyone ever asks you about me, you can say, I don't know, or ask my mother. So I was already being conditioned not to talk or complain.
Yeah, so those are 2 powerful statements. Now, did she just teach you that randomly, or had you done something, or had she done something that made her like come back to you with that?
So in that particular case, she had, I was a little bit younger than that. And I remember I was watching the news, and there was a big cocaine shipment. There had been a big bust of cocaine. And I pointed at the TV and said, "Oh, my mom does that." And the people I was with, it was an older couple, some friends of my mom's, and they must have told her that I said that, because when she got home and picked me up from their house, she taught me those 6 words. I don't know, and ask my mother.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're dealing with is a mom who's paying more attention to the men in her life. She's moving you all over the place. Sounds like neglect, sort of like all over the place. You mentioned abuse to sexual and physical.
Yeah.
How did that stuff progress through your childhood? Was it the same? Did it intensify? Like, say, for instance, the physical abuse. How did that manifest itself throughout your childhood?
So the physical abuse was probably, again, a lot of people my age can relate, started with spankings, spankings with a spatula or a wooden spoon. And then that would happen when she was drunk. And so that would become beyond a spanking. And then the physical abuse on her end, when I was in high school and things were getting really out of control for her and her boyfriend, and she couldn't really defend herself against him, she would take it out on me. So she would try to fight back sometimes with one of her boyfriends, and I think would be frustrated and so mad. And so then she would turn on me, and she started hitting me and punching me, pretty much with the same physical force that she wanted to hit him. And I did, I was quite a few inches taller than her. I was probably 4 or 5 inches taller than her, and I started blocking her hits, which made her mad, really mad. So it intensified when I was probably junior, senior in high school. It got really intense, the physical abuse. And then I started standing up for myself more.
How were you making sense of all of this? So your mom, like, say, for instance, hitting you. What was your thought about why this is happening?
I was always really shocked by it, because I was the one protecting her. I was the one who was putting my body between her and the men all the time. And then when she turned on me and started to hit me, I think shocked and confused was really the first reaction. Like, what are you doing? And I remember holding her and kind of making her look at me and saying, "It's me. Like, look, it's me that you're doing this to." Because it almost seemed like sometimes she was kind of glazed over. And obviously she was high and she was drunk, so she was glazed over. But I do remember that feeling of, if she just realized it was me, she would stop. And then there came a time when I was about 16 or 17 when I realized it didn't matter that it was me. She knew it was me. And I think prior to that, I had wanted to believe that if I could just get through to her in that moment of rage, she would stop. And she didn't. And then she wasn't going to. So I think I was confused a lot. And, that confusion, even after she stopped hitting me, that confusion stayed, and that kind of shock that, like, she had raised me to believe it was like her and I against the world, and her and I against all the monsters. And then I realized, that she was one of the monsters. And she had not only had become one of the monsters in my mind, but she had probably been one of the monsters for a lot longer than I realized.
And as you look back, and the treatment that you've had to do for yourself to reconcile all of this past, looking back, what do you think you were doing as a child to be resilient through this, to survive this, to get through it?
Well, I definitely started hurting myself. I was looking to control a situation, and I was about 15, and I had done a research paper about bulimia, and I realized that act of binging and purging I could control, because I couldn't control anything else in my life at that point. I certainly couldn't control her. I couldn't control what was happening in our house. And so I started controlling my body, and that felt really good at 15 years old. I think the other resilience is that I didn't have a choice. She had placed in front of me this little baby when I was 11, my sister Bevins, and basically told me that I was the baby's father. So that was every single night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I would miss school to take care of Bevins. And I had this baby that was mine, and I had to feed her, and I had to change her diaper. And I was her protector from my mom's boyfriend at the time. And so I had no choice but to be resilient. So even after a long night of fighting and breaking, glass and windows and smashing things, I still had to get up, and I had to either get myself ready for school, or I had to feed Bevins and take care of her. And so there was no time to not be resilient. And there was certainly no opportunity to choose otherwise. When she's telling me that she's pregnant, and she's pregnant with this horrible, horrible man with his baby, and we had just gotten him out of our lives, and then she reveals to me that she's pregnant, and I'm terrified because I figure that means he's got to come back, and be a dad, or whatever that meant. And she said, "No, you're going to be the dad." And I remember telling her, but first of all, I'm not a boy, and I'm only 10. Yeah. And she was like, "I know. Here we go." And she had actually convinced me that she put my name on the baby's birth certificate. And we have since found out that wasn't true, but that was part of the gaslighting, was that I was so enmeshed in all of this that I was actually legally the baby's father.
Oh, wow. That's a big thing. I know from your book that you didn't live with your mom the whole time. You went and lived at your dad's house and then came back.
So, yeah, I was 13, and I was really cramping my mom's style, and I was becoming so aware of who she was, and I was judging her actions and all of that. She sent me to my dad's, and I knew my biological dad a little bit, but not great. And I went to his house for most of 9th grade, and he was wonderful, and his wife was wonderful, and my little brother Clint was wonderful, and it was idyllic in many ways. Sweet and loving and normal, and I didn't know how to exist in that world at all. And I was spinning, and I was confused, and I was bored, and I was trying to find a place for myself in that world. And meanwhile, I knew my mom was over here with Bevins, and I knew that Bevins was living with this man who hated her, and she was a toddler. And I just couldn't shake that she wasn't being protected. And so after the, 8 or 9 months I spent with my dad, and he could see it too. He knew that I was pretty addicted to rescuing my mom and Bevins. And we had a talk about that. And so when I made that decision not to come back, it was because I had gone and I had seen where Bevins was and what she was about to be living in this new town she was going to be living in. And I just couldn't leave her again. And so I called my dad and told him I wasn't coming back. And it turned out, the year following that was the most violent, most awful year of my whole life. But I don't know what would have happened to Bevins or my mom had I not stayed.
I wonder how much of some of your healing has been thinking about and reconciling the fact that you were forced to be an adult. In the field, we often refer to that as a parentified child.
Right.
A child who is forced to become a parent to either their parents or to the other siblings.
Yeah, for sure. I think I had to figure out, and part of my healing, I had to figure out how to have fun. I had to figure out how to lighten up. I had to figure out how not to parent everyone around me. I had to realize that at some point, and I know a lot of the work you probably do too is about that, that inner child. And did you ever get to be a child? And I think part of that is why I've been drawn to teaching. So I spent 4 years teaching middle school. And there's something about, they say that you end up teaching the age at which you have kind of the most to reconcile with, right? And I ended up teaching middle school for 4 years, and then I've taught high school for the other 23. And both of those ages are times when I really, really needed a lot. I needed somebody to see me. And so I needed somebody to just let me be a kid. And so a lot of my teaching practice is about, recognizing kids who are caring too much and helping them just remember that they're young and remember that, although they are mature and wise and they're honor students and they have all this stress, they can also have fun. So I think teaching's been incredibly therapeutic for that, for sure.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, being with those children and being able to help, did you find that it did allow you to be introspective more and to heal some of your own feelings?
I think watching the kids and learning what it was to be a kid, really, truly, and then creating a space for that. And I'm almost 55 years old and I have a blast in my classroom every day. I teach 9th graders and 12th graders, and it's just a joyful place, and it's a safe space, and we talk about our feelings, and we write a lot. I'm an English teacher, and they have given me so much. My first students are actually 42 years old this year.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And when you teach your students, how much thinking or observation do you have to make for yourself to not take sort of like your own feelings and experiences and sort of project them onto the student, so that you know how to kind of like not be too empathetic to them,
Right.
but yet be paying enough attention that they are seen and heard and cared for?
Yeah, and I think my first couple of years of teaching, I probably wanted to move in a bunch of kids with me for sure. That was before we had our daughter. I definitely was like, I could have a few kids living here. I could rescue them. And then having my daughter, I had Hannah my third year of teaching, that helped with some boundaries for sure. But I think also part of my teaching practice is helping kids to recognize reasons versus excuses, right? So they might come to school tired or hungry or stressed, and that is a reason, but that is not an excuse. Because if it's an excuse, then you're letting all of that stuff at home not only control you at home, but control you at school. And so really trying to help them separate that this is your space. This is where you get to be you. You get to be silly. You get to be funny. You get to talk back to me, which I think is really important. You get to say no to me as your teacher, because these are things you cannot do at home. And so I definitely provide that space for them.
In this world of mental health and helping youth who have a lot of challenges, what you've just described is the way to care and nurture children who have been traumatized.
Yeah.
And I'm really impressed with the example you gave around teaching children that they can say no, or that they can disagree. That's kind of what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
And I think as parents, it's hard for parents to understand that value, to help children discover who they are, their authentic self. We live in a society where parents are supposed to, quote unquote, control their children, make them do certain things. What would you say to parents out there about why you teach the kids that they can say no to you or disagree with you?
Well, that really came as a parenting moment myself. My daughter was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and she was being bullied by a friend. And I said, well, why don't you just tell her no? And she looked at me and she said, well, you told me I can't say no. And think about it. When you have a little kid, you're like, don't you say no to me, young lady, or don't you say no, or you just are always kind of, at least I was. And not in a mean way. Like, I made a vow to myself when I decided to have a baby that I would never put my hands on her. I wouldn't yell if I could help it. I just, conscious parenting or whatever that phrase is, but I would just be really mindful. And so when Hannah said that to me, you don't let me say no. Wow. I mean, you could have knocked me over with a feather. I was blown away. I was like, oh, you're 100% right. And so what I started to do immediately was set up situations and scenarios where she could say no to me. And she could say no to her dad.
So how did you say that to her? How did you explain that to her? Like specifically like what the boundaries are around saying no?
Well, I think I set it up easily. Like, do you want carrots for dinner? And she'd say no. And I'd go, okay. And I wouldn't try to explain it, or I wouldn't try to convince her otherwise. I just allowed no to be a complete sentence, which is also something I learned from Oprah.
Ah, nice.
Where she says no is a complete sentence. And I tried to create situations where she did not have to explain why she didn't want to eat carrots or why she didn't want to go outside. And as she got older, I definitely gave her, again, more of that understanding around no means no. And no is a complete sentence. And you don't always have to explain yourself. And it doesn't mean that you're being rude. It doesn't mean that you're being impolite. Of course, there's a no thank you. Of course, there's other opportunities and times when you do need to be more gracious. But you can say no. And explaining boundaries to her was really big. Explaining boundaries for your body, explaining boundaries for your friendships.
And say more about how you would have that dialogue with her. What would that sound like?
So she was around some pretty strong-willed young girls. She was an athlete, growing up. And I would just tell her, it's okay to not do what they're doing. It's okay to have your own opinion. I certainly parented differently than some of my friends parented. And
how so? I'm sorry. How so?
Yeah, well, a lot of them I found they wanted to be friends with their kids. And not that I wasn't friendly with Hannah and adored her and loved being around her, but I also recognized that, when I was growing up, my mom always told us we were best friends, and her definition of that was pretty perverse, right? Her definition of that just meant that I was there for her all the time and put her before me. And so I think with Hannah, I just tried to parent her and say, I love you so much, but right now I'm going to be your mom. And right now I'm going to set boundaries that you're not setting, and I'm going to tell you no. And I know it's uncomfortable and you don't want to hear it and you're going to be mad, but I'm okay if you're mad at me for a while. And so when she was with her friends and she would say no, sometimes I would allow her to just blame it on me and say, just tell him your mom said no. And that was a nice out for her. And her friends thought I was the meanest mom in the world, but she was very grateful. She has a lot of anxiety. So she was very grateful to say, my mom said no. My mom said no, I can't do that. My mom said no. And then later it kind of became her own. She didn't have to use me as that, but just trying to give her a way, because I just was never allowed to say no to anybody growing up. And I always had to give people hugs, and I had to be in people's spaces, and I didn't make her hug anybody.
Good. Yeah.
She's not a hugger, right? She wasn't born a hugger. And I've just never pushed that on her. I've allowed her to have physical boundaries and emotional boundaries. And, she's 24 now, and she's an amazing person, and she is my best friend now. So, I feel like we made it through all of that. And she thanks me now for being a parent and saying no sometimes. She's understanding the value of that now, for sure.
Yeah, and those are all ways that you were protecting her that you didn't get.
100%. I mean, I waited all the time for my mom to tell someone no for me, and she never did.
And what about apologies? What do you teach your students and Hannah, your daughter, about adults apologizing to kids? Is that allowed?
I apologize to my students all the time. I had a kid last year that, in school, there's a physical safety. And so some kids, you can kind of put your hand on their shoulder. Some kids don't want to be touched at all. Some kids, you can shake their hand. Some kids need a hug, and all of those things are learned practices as a teacher. You just have to be very mindful of a kid's physical space. And I had a kid that was transitioning from female to male. And in that transitioning was setting up some real physical boundaries that I wasn't completely cluing into. And I had to say, I'm sorry, because I put my hand on his shoulder at one point and he flinched. And I came back and said, I'm so sorry.
Has your mother ever apologized to you?
No. She and I went no contact when Hannah was 1. So it's been 24 years that I stopped picking up the phone. She did come out a couple of years ago when I went public with the fact that I was publishing a memoir. She contacted my publisher and asked to read a copy with her lawyer. And I knew she didn't have a lawyer and she wasn't going to get a lawyer. So we just ignored it.
Do you think she's read your book?
I absolutely think she's read my book. I think she's not going to come out publicly and say anything, because to accept one part of the book, you have to accept all parts of the book. And I don't think she can do that. I didn't. What I think is interesting and what saddens me a little bit is that she learned all of the abuse. I talk about a few instances of sexual abuse in the book, and she didn't know about any of those. One of them she did kind of know, and she confronted the kid about it. But there were a couple of instances in there that she didn't know. And I don't know. There is a part of me that, although I don't need her to apologize, I've forgiven her in my own way. It just seems like it would be a decent thing at least to apologize to my little sister, who she has kind of had contact with over the years. I think it would be nice if she called her and said, wow, I didn't realize how scary this was for you, or I was so checked out. And I wish that for Bevins, because I think that she deserves an apology for sure.
Can you talk a little bit about how you came to make that decision that this is it, no more contact?
So I tried to go no contact many times in my 20s, but I had these 3 little sisters at that point, and my mom used them as bait, right? To kind of keep me hanging on. And she would get them on the phone and then grab the phone and ask me for what she needed. And those little sisters of mine were really the tether that I had with my mom in my 20s, when I was letting her go, but I had to hang on to them. And then when I decided to have Hannah, I was 30, and my mom was at her birth and standing over Hannah's bassinet when she was a day old. And my mom said, are you ready to have her love me more than she loves you and hate you? I mean, to say that to a mom of a 1-day-old, yeah. And so I could sense that we needed to distance ourselves. And then Hannah's first birthday, I watched my mom grab Hannah's birthday cake and just be really obnoxious and mean and kind of start to pit Hannah against me. And that was the moment where the whole wall came down. And I just realized, if I don't stop this now, she's going to have control of everything.
I think it was important that you took the time to really think through what needed to happen in your relationship with your mother. Being family doesn't automatically mean a relationship should continue. Sometimes healing and rebuilding trust is possible, and other times the healthier choice is frankly just to create distance or to step away. One thing we learn in relationships is that change requires accountability. When someone, like your mom, won't acknowledge the harm they've caused, take responsibility for their actions, or stop the harmful behaviors, protecting your own well being has to become the priority. In your case, Bridey, this wasn't just about protecting yourself. You also had the responsibility of protecting your daughter. That made it even more important to set the boundaries that supported both of your safety.
Yeah.
You brought up this idea of forgiveness, that you have forgiven your mom. What does that mean to you, forgiveness?
Well, it certainly was something that I fought against for a long, long time, because I felt like all I understood it to be was letting her off the hook. And I wasn't going to let her off the hook. And I wasn't going to let her think that all of this was okay, everything that she had done. And I thought, okay, somehow I need to figure out how to forgive. Not for her, but for me, because I have to release all of this stuff that I'm carrying. I was carrying so much anger and so much resentment and so much confusion and all of that stuff and all these stories. And so I watched Oprah, and she had a week of shows about forgiveness, and I didn't love her explanation where she said, thank you for giving me the experience. I now understand that a little better, but I was like, oh, that's not where we're going. And then it's kind of silly, but I was watching and reading the psychic medium, John Edward, and he was talking about how if we don't settle things with people in this life, then we're going to redo another lifetime. And I thought, oh, yeah, no, we're not doing that. This is my last spin with my mother in this cycle of being. And so one night I was in the bathtub, and, my grandmother, who I was very close to at the time, when she died, she'd been gone for a couple of years at that point. And I just heard her very clearly say to me, "I'm going to show you a movie." And she took me back and started showing me my mom when she was little. At all these different ages that I knew my mom lived and existed, and memories that she had shared with me. And I started to see her as a little girl, and I started to see her as a teenager. And I knew that she had gone through her own struggles of abandonment, and her mom was a drinker. And I just started to empathize with that little girl and know that she didn't want to grow up to be a narcissistic, abusive alcoholic who hurt people and let people hurt her. And so I didn't necessarily forgive my mom, but I forgave that little girl. And I started to understand her more. And I allowed myself to have compassion for that little girl and that teenage girl. And whenever that hurt came, which I still don't know exactly what it was, and I would imagine there's mental illness that was triggered in there. I've had theories that my mom probably struggles with bipolar disorder or something along those lines, and self-medicates with drugs and alcohol. She's definitely never been formally diagnosed, but her highs are high and her lows are low, suicidal tendencies, homicidal threats. So they're really low. And I think it was just compassion for that little girl and that teenager that she was, that when did that shift happen? Not quite sure. But I have a real distinct memory of being 7 and watching her get physically hurt for the first time. She got kicked in the back by a boyfriend. And I think something switched there for her. And I think that a lot changed for her in that action and her allowing that person to stay in her life.
And I think what's really important is you're talking about forgiveness here for you, not for somebody else, which is really key. And you still found that place. And that didn't mean now I have contact with my mom, she's in my life. No, that's not about forgiveness. You still had to make decisions for your own self, your own safety, your own well-being, to not have that relationship while still taking care of yourself through the forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, I realized that I was holding on to her and her stories in my body, and it was making me sick. I was growing cysts in my uterus, and my gallbladder was shutting down, my gums were infected. I mean, every system in my body, about 2 years after I went no contact with my mom and I was kind of out of that fight or flight adrenaline rush, every system shut down. And it was like it had been waiting. It was just waiting to make me pay attention to myself. And I had 2, near death, like within hours of dying experiences. And that was enough to say, if I don't let her go in every way, in my body, in my heart, in my soul, I'm going to carry her with me forever. And I'm going to let her control. She had controlled the first 30 years of my life, and I didn't want her to control the next 60, and I didn't ever call her and tell her she's forgiven, and I don't plan on it, and I don't care, because it's not about her, right? It's just about me just letting it go and healing what's in me and knowing that I'm okay.
You mentioned having a couple near-death experiences. Was that as an adult because of health and things like that, or are you referring to experiences as a child?
That was as an adult. So, yeah, I had a pretty advanced case of periodontal disease, which the dentist attributed to stress. And that caused an infection in my sinuses that I was a few hours away from dying when they discovered that. Yeah. And then I had they wanted to give me a hysterectomy, and I had a botched surgery because of that. And I think those were wake-up calls for sure. That I had to get healed, mind, body, and soul.
Yeah, and so it was showing up through the stress, and then it was having a physical reaction. Describe what the stress was.
Well, I think when you grow up in trauma, you're so good at negating it and talking yourself out of it and ignoring the pain and ignoring any kind of self-care. And I was also raised really broke. So we weren't going to doctors, and you were only going to a dentist if you had an abscess, right? If you had a medical emergency, were you going to the doctor? So even if in my 20s I was having some toothache, I would always wait until I had to go to the ER for a toothache. I just didn't have the understanding of taking care of myself at all. And so I think that's to my detriment. By the time that I realized I was sick, it was always, we have a kind of a joke in my house that, like, when I say I'm sick, get me to the doctor right now because it's urgent. I'm getting much better at self-care.
Good.
Much, much better at self-care. But yeah, I think when you're raised not going to doctors and dentists, and you're not getting therapy, and you're not taught at all to take care of yourself, it always waits until, I was ignoring myself, and my body finally said, guess what? You're going to take care of yourself, whether you like it or not.
It's great that you listened to that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you're here today.
Yeah. Thank you.
Blessing us with your presence and your wisdom and knowledge. So I want to go back to some of the sibling relationships here for a little bit. So for all intents and purposes, it's sort of like you've raised Bevins a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really remember the other ages of the other siblings. Like, were you raising them as well?
So my mom had 3 girls, and one of my sisters was born when I was a junior in high school, and the other sister was born when I was a freshman in college. And by that time, I was really moved out. So I stopped living with my mom when I was 16 for, 6 months. And then my senior year of high school, I didn't live with them hardly at all. So the little girls, the youngest girls, I didn't have a lot of contact with them. A little bit in college, and tried to show them college and tried to be a sister. But our mom had really poisoned them against me by that point. Although she wanted to take credit for my success going to college and being a straight A student and all those things, she knew she didn't have anything to do with it. She wasn't paying any money. She had nothing. If anything, she was just getting in the way. And so at that point, my success became kind of a place of resentment for her. And she used that with my younger sisters. And so their story about who I am is probably very different than who I really am. Mm-hmm. And I was hopeful, I haven't spoken to the younger girls in probably almost 20 years.
Oh, wow.
Maybe
okay.
15 to 20 years. And I was hopeful that they were going to read the book and learn a little bit about how hard I tried.
Yeah.
I really did try to help them, and I really did try to stay in their lives, and it just became impossible. And I think that hurts my heart that I really was able to be in Bevan's life fully and help her as she got older to navigate her own childhood and understand what happened. But I haven't been able to do that for the other girls. And they're so connected to our mom now that there will not be a relationship until that's severed, however that gets severed.
And do you know if their feelings towards you are because they have misinformation about you, or is it a resentment towards you because they didn't have you to protect them?
I think it's both. I think it's been very important for my mom to give them the story that she wants them to think. Yeah. They have an idea that a friend of our family paid my way through college, which is not true. They have an idea that, I think I'm better than all of them, which to some extent I am better than my mom. I'm okay saying that. But yeah. I think that's the narrative that she needed to keep them close to her and not kind of reaching out to me. And I think at this point, they probably don't know if they can reach out to me, and until they get healthy, I'm not ready for them to reach out either. There won't be a relationship quite yet. My sister Bevins asked me years ago, how did you do it? How did you get away and stay away? And and have a life and a career and all these things. And I said I made very hard, very unpopular decisions. And I think that's the thing that's uncomfortable for people.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to make those hard decisions. We don't want to make the unpopular decisions. We don't want family to hate us or not like us or talk negatively about us. But that's just the reality, and I know my truth, and I know the life I'm living, and I know that I've tried my best, and I didn't try to hurt anybody else. I just tried to save myself and create a life.
Yeah. And, like decisions like what?
Decisions like not calling and participating, and decisions that when I do find out new information about family members, I cut them off too. This book has revealed some really awful things about some people in my family who I have maintained contact with and no longer do. And so those hard decisions continue. And I wish it was different, but it's not. And I'm prepared to continue setting boundaries because, again, people have free will, and people are making their own choices about drugs and alcohol and abuse and who they are as people. And, I can't stand in front of my students and tell them, all the things I tell them about making a better life and feel like a liar or feel unauthentic. And I think especially now in my work with all the themes in the book, I do advocacy work, for domestic violence shelters and for child abuse, advocacy groups. And I want to be speaking from truth. And I don't want to be connected to people who are hitting their children or people who are drinking and neglecting their kids or people who are hurting children in other ways. And so I think, again, if I get new information about family, we just let that go and say goodbye. And my Christmas card list continues to get shorter and shorter.
And actually, I do want to know, where is your relationship with Bevins? Like, what's the role you play in her life currently?
I talk to her almost every day. Yeah, and I'm very close to her boys. And I think in our 20s, it was confusing because I didn't know how to be her sister. And she didn't understand why I couldn't just be her sister and why I was still her mom all the time. And even into our 30s. And then when I started writing the book, and then when the book came out and she could read it, she's not a crier. And she called and she was crying and she said, I get it now. I didn't know what you gave up to take care of me. She didn't know that I had chosen her basically over staying with my dad in a very normal functioning family. And she finally, with the book, was able to understand the separation that I just couldn't kind of figure out between being a mom and a sister. And I think I'm still there's a motherly love for her that I will always have. But I do understand my role is as her sister. And we, it's the greatest relationship that I have in my life, right along with my husband and my daughter. And that's why I dedicated the book to her too. It's just to, she didn't have a lot of memories growing up because, unlike me, she didn't remember things. She blocked them all out. And so she doesn't have a lot of memories before 16. And so the book gave her memories and was able to help her kind of sort through some things and also give her pride about her own journey and what she has been resilient about and how brave she has been. And so it's been a really positive thing. She has lost communication with our mom because of the book. Our mom was very upset that Bevins let me use her real name.
With all the abusive men who were around when you were young, has that changed your relationship with men? Has anything come up in your relationship with your husband or with intimacy?
Yeah, I think as a kid who was sexually abused several times by people we trusted, I think intimacy has been a real issue in terms of just trust and in terms of being okay with my own sexuality. I was pretty disgusted by my mom's sexuality, quite honestly. It was not something that I I thought was healthy or reasonable. And so I think having to come to terms with intimacy and being vulnerable and allowing someone in and allowing love and being vulnerable enough to be loved and to give love and to trust him. I think that has been the better part of our 30-year marriage, is really finding that place to be trusting of him. And I know a lot of women my age can relate to that, because you just set up walls. You set up a lot of walls, and it doesn't mean you're not intimate with your friends and your girlfriends and you love everyone so much. I'm a super loving person, but when it comes to sexuality and my own physical sexuality, it's much harder for me to be vulnerable. And even though I trust my husband with everything, my sexuality was really, as a little kid, you're blamed for it, right? And even though she didn't know what was happening, I knew what was happening. And I started wondering, why are they all doing this to me? Because it was succession. It was time after time after time. It was several times before I was 10 years old. And I just kept wondering, what am I doing to bring on this attention? What am I doing to let these men know this is okay to do this to me or to be this way with me? And you question yourself as a kid, for sure, and especially as a teenager. And, I joke with my friends, I was the last virgin in my group. So maybe there was a good outcome to it in some sense, that I just waited a long time because I was like, no, I'm good. I was deathly afraid of becoming pregnant because I already had a baby, right? I already had my sister.
Yes. I want to ask you about how you've gone about your healing process. What's been really key for you?
Writing has been everything. As someone who didn't grow up with therapy as an option, I never understood therapy, never opened up to therapy, and I'm sure therapy would have done me some good and still would. I did try therapists a couple of times, and I just had a hard time speaking because I was lying. At that point, I wasn't ready to tell the truth to the therapist or to myself. And so I found talk therapy to be very hard. I have since gotten into meditating quite a bit, and that has helped. But I think writing, first and foremost, writing down all the stories, every single story I could think of, and just exercising those up and out of my body. And sometimes with a pen and a pencil, sometimes I just hit the Google tool of a microphone and I just talked. And I talked through every single story I could think of. And that started in my mid-30s after I was so sick. I started documenting and writing down all these stories. What I found about writing is that not only are you bringing these things up and you face them again, you hear those voices, you smell those smells, you hear the sound, you turn on music to trigger you, to take you back to that moment. But what I also found about writing is that I was telling myself stories I had never told myself before. And I was listening to stories that I had quieted for a long time.
Were there ever times where what you experienced with your mom would come up for you, that you were replicating it, that you caught yourself either talking like her, doing something that she did that scared you or just got your attention?
For sure. I had been dating my husband, or we'd been actually maybe married at that point. We'd been together 2 or 3 years, and we had gone through Thanksgiving a couple times. And I think it was our third Thanksgiving together. And I was opening cans of green beans and cans of fruit cocktail and cans of sweet potatoes and putting together this meal that I didn't really like, but this is Thanksgiving. It's how I was raised. I was raised in school buses and in motel rooms, right? So everything was canned in my life. We got free boxes of food on the porch. So we had a lot of non-perishables. So everything was canned. And my husband looked at me this Thanksgiving and he goes, did you ever think about we could make fresh green beans instead of canned? And I was like, what are you talking about? He goes, well, my mom makes cranberry sauce from the berries. She boils them. What? My mind, my whole world just exploded because I realized I was making my mother's Thanksgiving. It was food I hated. It didn't taste good, but that is how you made it. You lined up 15 cans. You opened them up, you put them in bowls, they were lukewarm, and that was Thanksgiving. And that was really a massive shift in my thinking, that I could do Thanksgiving different from my mom. And I never again opened another can of anything on Thanksgiving, ever. And I think the other a bit more powerful was after Hannah was born, I was kind of running around doing everything with this little newborn, as you do, right? And I had this beautiful husband sitting there looking at me every day, asking if he could help. And finally, she was probably a month old, and he said, "Are you ever going to let me do anything?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, you don't let me help." And I said, "Well, I don't know what dads do. I have no idea what you're supposed to do." And so being mindful of those two moments that came about because I chose a partner, again, who was very sweet and kind and had a completely different life experience than I had had. And he was able to come in and say, "I mean, it's okay that you do this, but have you thought about doing it a different way?" And that's been our whole 30 years of marriage, is him kind of understanding and valuing my story, but also opening me up to a new way to look at it or new ideas about it.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on this show and opening up and sharing and letting us learn from your experiences. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And thanks for having this space. I mean, it's a lot to talk about families, and it's a lot to talk about mental health. And I am so grateful that, it's a trending topic,
Yeah.
trauma healing and self-care and all those things.
Yeah,
because
it is.
It's time.
It is time. All right, where can people go online to learn more about you or to find you?
Well, I'm on Instagram as Bright Eyes Author, and I'm also on Facebook just with my author name, Bridey Thelen-Heidel, and I do have a website, brideythelenheidel.com.
Bridey gave a really great TEDx talk called Rob the Trauma, Steal Back Your Life, and we have a link to that on our show page. Go to nexusfamilyhealing.org/podcast. In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing, a national nonprofit mental health organization. You can learn more about Nexus and how to support our mission at nexusfamilyhealing.org. The show is produced by John Moe with music from Jeremy Messersmith. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe, rate, and write a review. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray. See you next time.